The ideas and information explored in this webinar are featured in Identifying and Supporting Gifted English Language Learners, Equitable Programs and Services for ELLs in Gifted Education, available from proofrock.com. So let me introduce today's speaker, Mary Campbell. She's an award-winning and national board-certified English and new and second language learner teacher, and was in Charlotte, North Carolina. She is now currently pursuing her PhD in curriculum studies and instruction at Florida State University. Welcome, Mary. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Mary, can you, just for the audience, and I know, this is a topic English language learners, we're exposed to these kids and we're working with these kids in the schools, but just for the sake of this discussion, can you kind of, from your perspective and in the federal definition, talk to what is an English language learner? What kind of kid are we talking about?
Great. So an English learner is any student in the U.S. schools who receives the label of learning a new language. And how do they get that label? So when, according to Title III funding, whenever a student enters U.S. schools, the school is required to send home something called a home language survey. And it can look different from district to district or state to state, but the main components are all the same, which is does your child speak another language in the home? And if so, what languages? And then some other questions may be, does anyone else in the home speak another language? How much can your child read in that language? Those questions are to give the district an idea of, could there be another language in the home? And if there is another language in the home, then that student is usually assessed to see if they're an English learner. If they're something called a WIDA state, meaning the state uses the WIDA assessments, and that's coming from Wisconsin. So WIDA is an organization that I believe at this time it's 46 to 48 states have accepted WIDA as their assessment instrument for English learners. And this assessment is a way to identify English learners initially. It's also a way to measure their proficiency and growth over time. So when an English learner is initially identified, they receive something called the WAPT, and that says whether the child is learning English or if they are not learning English. If they're learning English, they're identified as an English learner. If they are not, then they're considered mainstream or native English speaker. Once they're identified, then that's when the state is required to add the label, and then they're added to their overall head count. And head count meaning that the child is federally required to have access to curriculum content as well as language support. And that language support can look very different from state to state. Thank you. There are 40 states as WIDA and the WIDA Consortium. And it's constantly growing. Like I remember when I first started, it was like 32. So it grows and grows. And so once they're identified, then they are considered an English learner.
That makes sense. And then, okay, so you got that population of kids. Mm-hmm. And then as your book makes a good case for it, we're in that population of kids. There's no reason to expect that there wouldn't be an equal proportion of gifted kids as a typical population of students. And yet we're not identifying those kids. And you give a couple of examples. In Oklahoma, for example, while typically 10% of the student populations are identified for gifted or talented services, only about 2% of the English language learners are identified. And the numbers are actually worse in some of the states that have greater numbers of English language learners, like Nevada and California. Why is it so hard to identify giftedness among this population of kids? What are the challenges that schools are facing in this regard?
Mm-hmm. It's a very interesting question to think about. Why are certain districts doing such an amazing job with it, and then other districts sort of struggling? And I think it goes back to what the research has found for English learners, which is in very rural areas, it's very hard to identify them. Whereas in more urban areas, it tends to be a little bit easier. And also in very large, where there are areas where there are large populations, it's also hard. And I think that goes back to how teachers in urban areas tend to have a little bit more funding, and they also have more access to research-based information, because a lot of those urban areas are near universities, right? So because they are near those universities tend to have some sort of working relationship with those districts, and they're able to get the newest research in and have access to that information and then offer those professional developments. Whereas more rural areas, they may not always have that opportunity. Sometimes they do, but it's certainly not at the same scale as more urban areas are.
That makes sense. I also think, and you could speak to this as well. I think because these kids are impacted because English is a second language, or they're English language learners, when it comes to taking an IQ measure, taking an achievement measure, they're coming in at a deficit that kids who've have a lot of opportunities to learn the school related knowledge coming into the school. They're just, that competition got lost very early on for those kids. Can you talk a little bit about how do we overcome that piece as well?
Mm-hmm. I certainly think that sort of that cultural bias plays a role in some areas nationwide. We're seeing that now. There's a lot more cultural bias being spoken about. Not that it didn't always exist, but we're becoming more aware of that. And what we see when it comes to identifying gifted English learners, there's still some of that bias that's coming into our account. Like when certain districts or certain states are only using one or two measures for identifying English learners, well, you have to think, is that measure biased? Is that instrument accounting for differences? Is it being offered in another language? And how well is that instrument in evaluating that student's needs or that student's abilities? Because what we see is there's very, very low crossover for instruments and what they're supposed to be assessing. So there's this discrepancy between, if you're supposed to be assessing this, are you really assessing that with that instrument? And so that's why having additional factors to consider for identifying gifted English learners is so important, because that English learner may be gifted, but you didn't catch them because you only did one screener, and that one screener wasn't offered in their home language, or was a very biased screener. So a lot of things to consider on that end.
Yeah, I think so. And for the audience, I'm going to move us to the practical classroom strategies and that sort of thing in a little bit. But I did want to flesh out this identification piece. And it was, obviously I've got, you give as an example in the book the Charlotte Mecklenburg schools, and they use a teacher rating scale that's not from Proofrock, the GRS, but we also have the scales for identifying gifted students, the SIGs, along with Hope and Renzulli. But the SIGs is the one that's been really on my radar, because we just released the second edition of that instrument. But the way those instruments work is they ask the teacher to rate a child's behaviors in certain areas in comparison to the peers that the child has. So English language learners will be compared to other English language learners. In other words, people with the same, coming into the school with the same opportunities to learn school-related skills and knowledge. You're looking for the top performers in that one peer group, and you can also look at kids in the rural areas. You're looking for kids in poverty. You're looking for different, racial and ethnic groups and that sort of thing. But your comparison groups are people who've had the same background that you have had, and you can find the top performers with those because those teachers know that. And you give this great example in the book. You start off with this great example in the book of a kid that you saw that was performing at much higher levels than his peers. Could maybe talk a little bit about that experience as kind of a seminal thing for you.
Yes. It's actually really nice because my partner, I call her my partner. She was the person who sort of trained me in all of this. She's here today. So hi, Melanie from Charlotte, North Carolina. She'll know this story. So it was during my early years as a teacher, and I had a student who came in, a first grader, and he was performing much higher than all of the other English learners who I had in his group. And when I say higher, so he came in not knowing his letter sounds or his letters, but he was grasping concepts so quickly compared to his peers. Like I remember he learned all of his letters and letter sounds within like a couple of weeks. And I was shocked. Like for anyone who's worked with kindergartners or it usually takes a little while, right? Like we're taking a few weeks to understand like letter sound correspondence and the alphabetic principle. And he grasped it so quickly. And then he was able to manipulate those sounds and to understand how you start to put those letter sounds together to make consonant clusters. And I was amazed because that's a skill that usually takes many others at least a year to learn. And it wasn't just in reading that he was doing this. He was doing this with math. And you could give him, I remember I say we, it was really Melanie. Melanie had these really great sheets that were tangram like, and you would have the sheet and then it would have like an animal or something on it. And then the student would have to use the tangrams to make whatever was on that sheet in some form. And he was able to always do it very quickly. And almost any extension I gave him, because he would always finish quickly, like I would ask him questions like, well, what about this? And could you do that? And he always could. And I spoke with his teacher, and she noticed a lot of the same trends that I did. And it was really very impressive, very, very impressive.
Yeah, that makes sense, and that jives with, part of the process of renorming the SIGs was we had to we took anonymized data that we were pulling from the test sites, and the nice thing about a SIGs is you get quantitative data that is the pure ratings, but then the teachers are also can put in some qualitative data, that the things that they're observing. And the example I presumably this audience has probably heard me give that example, but it was this teacher who just sat down and said, this kid came from Mexico a year ago, and these are the things that I'm seeing, the progress that I'm seeing with this child, even though he won't score well on, some of the standardized measures because he still's not 100% up with verbal skills. He is making progress that other kids are not making in this classroom. And that is why I've scored him with a 5 across the board in each of the behaviors I'm observing. That's the power that those teachers can see that kind of progress that's happening there. You asked me to ask this question. So in asking this, please, audience members, don't think I'm asking this as if I just came up with it myself. Why is it important for us to identify English language learners who are gifted?
I love the question. I think it's so important. So for those of you who don't know, my background is in English learning. So I taught in Charlotte for about 8 years, and I became so fascinated with not just English learners, because that was already my bread and butter, but looking at English learners with gifted talents. And that was in large part because of Melanie. And it became important to me because of you see these children who are in the classroom, and I wouldn't say that it was something I saw in Charlotte, but I know it exists elsewhere, where teachers look at English learners and say, oh, they can't be gifted. Oh, they can't do that because they're learning a language. Oh, we don't have time to consider them as gifted because they got to play catch up. They have to learn the language. And it's so much this deficit model, but really you're doing harm to that child because they are capable of so much more, but you're not able to see it because you're looking at it with this negative mindset. And so it's, to me, it's very important that these children are identified to be able to have those extensions and have those great opportunities instead of being brushed aside. I was very, very fortunate to work in a school where, one, I had somebody who was an expert in gifted, talented education, but also working with teachers who really knew what to do with students who had that potential and to push them. And so when I hear about other schools or other districts that aren't doing it, and then you read so many news articles about how English learners are being underrepresented nationwide, it's really disheartening because you know they're capable.
That's funny because Stephanie and I were in a call just yesterday with Colin Seal, and those of you who know Colin Seal is a very popular author in the field, and this is exactly what Colin was talking about, but he was talking about all underrepresented populations of kids, but he was just so concerned that with all of the talk of, the kids are going to be coming in next year at a deficit, and there's going to be all this remediation, and there's going to be all this catch up being that he's just, I think that's just going to kill some of these kids that we ought to be raising the ceiling for a lot of these kids. And like his phrasing is lowering the floor and raising the ceiling and giving a lot of kids the opportunities that we're talking about, because they don't thrive. These gifted kids, just aren't thriving in a remediation kind of model or something. So that's kind of the identification piece, which was half the book that we focused on. And I guess there was one thing too that I before we move to the practice piece, what if you were thinking through just, if I'm a school coordinator, I'm a teacher who's got some ownership in the program. What are some of the first things that I might want to do? Some of the early stages of that, if I wanted to try to identify more English language learners.
That's a great question. I think it starts with the English learning teacher, the English or the ESL teacher, and the AIG or gifted, talented, however your district calls it, that teacher, the two of them coming together with the school coordinator. And there has to be buy-in, right? Like there has to be someone who says, yes, I want to do this. And it's not just another thing added to their plate. Because if it's something that's just added to their plate, it's not really going to happen. But if you have admin buy-in and then your two come together, that's when you can really start to collaborate, and you can start to say, sharing information, because I think that's mostly where it starts. Because as an English language teacher, I was not really trained on gifted, talented. I was not aware of really what to look for or how to support it or how to offer those extensions. My main area was English learning. Like, let me teach them English, how to read, write, speak, and listen, of course. And so it's really important that collaboration takes place, because on the other side of the spectrum is the AIG teacher, and they may be aware of what gifted, talented looks like for English learners, but they also may not be. And so that's where coming together and sharing, like, okay, this is what I'm seeing. Okay, this is what you're seeing. But before you can even get to that point of seeing, you have to know what to look for. And before you can get to the what are you looking for, you need to have a relationship, right? You need to know, like, okay, this is the AIG teacher, this is the ESL teacher, this is my schedule, this is your schedule. How many kids do you have on your caseload? Can we set up a time to start meeting, and make it something regular? And that's that first step, like establishing that relationship and then coming together. It was also very fortunate for me that Melanie was right across the hall from me. So there was literally a lot of yelling going on, like, hey, are you over there?
That's, and what you're saying is I think what some people who are more visionary than I am. I mean, Emily Mofield brought us that book, Collaboration, Co-Teaching, and Coaching in Gifted Education, a few years ago. Well, not 3 or 4 years ago. I can't remember exactly when we saw the prospectus, but I remember thinking, oh, I don't know why we need this, and the editors kind of pushed back, and Emily pushed back, and was like, okay, well, well, it turns out I was completely wrong about that, that we are moving to a model, particularly as we start trying to identify for equity and try being kids who didn't traditionally look like what we thought a gifted kid looked like in the past, bring those kids into our program. We're actively going out and collaborating and co-teaching and coordinating with other parts of the school building at this point. So what you're describing is exactly what I'm hearing, from others as well. It's becoming part of what if it wasn't already part of what we were doing, it's what we're doing. It's on the menu now. Let me move you a little bit. Before I move into the practices part, and I know you're going to share some resources and some really interesting materials, some that appeared in the book and some that did not. Let me ask folks, if you've got questions, please go down to that Q&A box and pose questions in the Q&A box. We're not monitoring the chat box. We are monitoring the Q&A box, and you can also upvote questions so that when we get to the Q&A portion that Stephanie McCauley will be handling, she'll know from your upvotes which questions are most important. Mary, let me ask you to talk a little bit. You kind of talk first about what parents can do to help enrich the experiences of the kids and how they can become involved in school and how we can bring them in. And then you also talk about some of the things that teachers can do. Can you kind of talk a little bit about those practices and what works?
Yes. So at the teacher level, I think what's most important is that relationship piece, and also that exchanging of the information. I call it a meeting of the minds, where you come together and say, okay, these are my students, this is what I see. And then also with the AIG teacher saying, like, okay, here's what I'm seeing. Because what was very fortunate in my district was we did something called nurturing. And I'm probably calling it something that they don't call it, but in my head, it was nurturing. And it's before a child is identified as gifted. So what do you do in those early years? So like for K2, like before they're identified in second grade. And that to me was the most important time frame, like meeting with those kindergarten, first grade, second grade teachers and explaining, these are your identified English learners, but also these are some things you can do to get those enrichment activities. So that was really important for us. And then once they are identified, meeting with those teachers and the K are in the 3-5 grade levels and having constant communication. And it could be anywhere from like a quick email. It could be a show up at your door, like when children are coming in saying like, hey, how's it going? This was just something that needed to happen naturally. And it seemed to work really well. And if it's at all possible, have co-planning, have time where your team has planning, but your ESL teacher and or your AIG teacher are able to be there. It's so important when you're doing those team plans to add in already, like this is the ESL component, this is the extension component, to already have it built into your team lesson plans rather than just, okay, here's like my extracurricular bucket. Like an extracurricular bucket is nice if you don't have any support, but the dream obviously is to have a true culture of advocacy in your whole school where everyone is on board and everyone is pushing all the students to do their best. And that was something I think we did a really good job with.
Mm-hmm,
Yeah.
mm-hmm. I noticed that in the book, for you talking about the success that you guys had, you talk about the concern about kids who get identified for the gifted program, then drop out after a while. And you go through some things that you would recommend as important pieces to a program that will keep kids in the program. And one of them was, and this came up both when you talked about what you talk to parents about, but it's also what you talk to teachers about, is maintaining high standards of rigor and challenge for those kids. That they again, it's back to Colin's idea. The engagement is critical with that challenging content. You also talk about opportunities for those kids to be interacting with peers and peer collaboration. What do you mean by that in the classroom?
So yes, it was like two questions, and so I'm not.
Oh, sorry. I realized. You know what happened was I got going with the first part of the question, then I realized, well, that kind of goes without saying. Like, you maintain high standards, and then I thought, well, there's not a question there. So then I moved to the next one. Sorry, but I led you down the wrong
You're
path.
good. I want to touch on that first part, which is the high standards, because it's so important. It cannot be stressed enough how important those high standards are. And it goes back to that implicit bias that everyone has. And it's very easy to say, oh, they're English learners, they don't need the extension. Only these kids need the extension. And that's why it's really important during that team planning to make sure that it's clear, like, even though your L teacher and your AIG teacher are there, these are not just things for AIG and these are not just things for ELLs. There needs to be an even flow where every child is being challenged. And I think it's really easy to say, have high expectations. Like, you have a staff meeting and somebody says you have to have high expectations. It's very easy to say. I think what is much harder is, how do you do it? How do you hold children to that high expectation? And what I've found the best, and there was one teacher who did an amazing job of this at our school. She always held them to a high expectation. And the way she did it was, she said, this is the standard. This is where you're going to be. But at every step of the way, she supported them. And they knew they could do it, but they also knew she was there. And so she was constantly goal setting with them. And so having children coming up with their own goals to push, I think, is how you balance that high expectation to help them reach that point. I wanted to make sure I touched on that, because it's so easy to say, have high expectations, but nobody really knows how to do it. And that goes back to your second part of the question about English learners and how do you keep them in? And it's, you have to have that constant high expectation, but at the backbone of that is your knowledge of that child, right? That relationship that you've built, and that, it's what I like to call, it's a helix, right? You're in a constant state of learning about that child and how they're growing. It's never just, oh yeah, I know something about them. You should know as much as you can about that child, because that's going to help you and them to have higher expectations, right? And if you have that relationship with the child, they're going to be more likely to stay in the program. Whereas if they feel like you just view them as like, oh, you're another checkbox for me, like, oh, you're in the program, here's some extra worksheets for you, that doesn't make anyone want to stay, right? Like, if I just had to do extra worksheets, why am I here? So it's building that relationship and community where the English learner feels like their home and they have a place there with the teacher, but also with their peers, right? They have this connection to want to do their best because of that dynamic, that environment that you created.
That's yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and that's super consistent with what you were talking about in the book, of the importance of those things. And it also struck me that a lot of the interventions that you're talking about that are successful with ELL kids who are gifted are gifted, like the things that we think of as strategies in gifted land. We've got you want those kids actively as opposed to passively learning. You as the teacher are scaffolding. You recommend inquiry-based instruction, and Renzulli kind of exposure to different kinds of talent areas that they can find their passions. But then you also talk about this higher order thinking skills. And maybe what I'm going to do now is kind of step back, because I know you had some resources that you wanted to share that we have on the website, as well as some outside of our website resources that the folks might want to access. So I'm going to just sort of let you take it away and talk a bit about that.
Great, thank you. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so the first one is from the book page. So on Proofread Press, these are some resources at the bottom that I used, and there wasn't room in the book, so we thought, let's make them available here. So these are available, and when you click on them, it takes you to the page. So this is one that I did with my students very often, and it's a gingerbread activity where you give the student the printout of this, and what they do with it is they make the person, a gingerbread person, look like somebody from their culture, and they draw the flag of their country, and then they decorate their little person and they share about it. And my students were younger students and they really like this, but I've done this with middle schoolers, high schoolers, and they also really enjoyed it. You'd be surprised how much high schoolers really enjoy like arts and crafts activities. I think they think of it as a nice break. And another one, this one is a student learning interest survey. And it's helpful for you to think about. It goes back to that building the relationship with the child. Once you have an idea of what they like, you're able to support them better. So just some general likes, and then a Likert scale, and then some short answer ones. And some of these short answer ones will give you some sense of their creative thinking. So one of them is, what fruit or vegetable best fits who you are? I remember Melanie does some of these. So my partner, she'll recognize some of these. This one is, you've been awarded a grant to come up with Ben and Jerry's newest flavor of ice cream. What ice cream would you create? What would it be called? What flavors or ingredients would you include? And then this one is a coloring sheet. And what they do is they color the boxes that they like. So the blue boxes are for letter A, red for B, green, yellow, purple. And then they color in what they like. So if they don't like it, it just stays white. But this gives you a good idea of their interest. Quick, easy little thing you can do at the beginning of the school year. This one, a general student reflection. I had something similar in my classroom, and I just had them show with their hands at the end of the day, how do you feel about what we learned today? Beginner, intern, apprentice, or apprentice, master. And then these ones, I really like these ones. So this is for figurative language, and I tried to do a lot with figurative language with my English learners because it's a tough skill, right? Most of my English learners were conversational, but they weren't as familiar with idioms or different phrases, colloquialisms we use. And so with this activity, you're gonna just give them the directions, explain it. But you work with a partner, you read the task card, and you come up with something to go in the blank. And it's a good indicator for you to see, how are they thinking? What's their train of thought process like? And then this is a sort. These are when you're teaching reading, if you want them to understand the types of questions. So there's the right there question, the author and me think and search on my own. This is very similar to, or this is from QAR, right? So they're the examples of questions. You just print them, cut them out, and then ask the students to sort the types of questions. So really quick activity, but fun.
And for the audience, I'll mention that Stephanie posted the URL to that page in the chat, but also I'll be sure that when I send the certificates out, that I'll give you a link to that material as well, so that you've got access to that after the presentation.
Great. And the last thing I wanted to share, again, there wasn't room in the book and it was too many pages for the web page, is something that Melanie and I created. It was called Hot Camp, or Higher Order Thinking Camp. And my page on here, on Teachers Pay Teachers, I'm called Language Learning Leader, and I'll put that in the chat. But I wanted to show you this. So we made something called a hot camp, and what it is it is a binder of activities that children can do to push their thinking. And you can see she made it with me. So in this kit, it sort of walks you through, you're going to print, copy, cut, laminate, all those fun activities from it. And then you'll need this book. So it's called Primary Education Thinking Skills. And if you don't have the book, that's fine. You would just skip this section of the hot camp.
That's a Pieces of Learning book. If you guys are looking for it, it's probably on Amazon, but it's certainly from the Pieces of Learning website as well. Sorry, Mary.
You're good. And it has the link here, so you can just click to get it. We're very fortunate. Our AIG TD department provided this for them. And so what we did with those from this book is we went through and found a bunch of different activities and copied them on cardstock, and then the students could do those activities for fun. I think my favorite activity from it was something called the limpets. And they're different little creatures that all look different, and I printed them, and they were Velcro. And so the kids took off all the little limpets and they had to organize them. They had to group them and explain why they grouped them that way. So it was just something fun. So then to go with the hot camp, we made something called Playway Pathway, however your district calls it. It's part of personalized learning. So what they did was I introduced these different stations, and there were patterns, inequalities, cause effect, analogies, creative thinking, and then maker space. And if you don't want to do the whole camp, you obviously could just do any one of these. And so underneath the Playway, it tells you what that one is. So for patterns, they're going to choose a pattern. For inequality, they're going to do an equation task card. For cause effect, they're going to use a book. For analogies, they're going to listen to a song and then make comparisons. Hiking, they're going to do a special worksheet. And then makerspace, their task cards, and then they get to create whatever product they want based on whatever task card they created. And then I had them do level 1, level 2, level 3. So for my students, I always let them choose where they think they are. So for example, I never made my students say, oh, you have to start at level 1 and then do level 2, level 3. I let them choose based on their own knowledge of themselves. And it seemed to work really well. As a caveat, it's not something that you can just say, okay, you choose. There needs to be some scaffolding involved where you explain the levels and how they work and how to self-reflect and what do you do if it's too easy? What do you do if it's too hard? So then I'll show you some of the examples. So the makerspace one was probably the most intensive to do. So this one looks like this. So it has the directions already on it, but it also has the task cards. So these are some of the examples of the tasks they can create. So they could do transportation, they could make a hybrid produce, they could do a catapult. The recycle one, that's the one that students tended to do the most, probably because it was the easiest. And so for that one, they just choose recycled items and then give it a new use. So I think they could do like, it could become a book, it could become a miniature car, it could become whatever they were interested in. And then these are some of the other ones. I like to give them choice because everybody's different. There's this one, which is technology based, so they can create a new app, but they create it pen and paper and then they explain how it'll work. There's also a coding one in case they're interested in coding. So that
Fantastic.
one is, yeah, that's the makerspace one. And then like I said, the hiking one, the complete the worksheet, that's from the pets book. So that's like the limpets. You just do it. And some of my kids loved the limpets so much that was all they did. Like they just decided to have a whole day of doing those like fun, even though they're actually worksheets, they loved them. So there's analogies, there's patterns, cause effect. I don't know if we want to walk through all of them, but I want
probably not, Mary, because I think we're going to run out of time, and I wanted to be able to get to the questions that the folks might have. But
yes.
But I'll definitely provide the links so that everybody can see the different things that you've got there, because it sounds like something really practical and super interesting. Yes. I'm going to take this moment now to turn this presentation over to Stephanie McCauley. But I did want to remind everybody while we're here, we're visiting about the identifying and supporting gifted language learners, equitable programs and services for ELLs and gifted education. That's available from the Proof Rock Press website, but it's also available from Amazon or your favorite bookseller. If you want to take a screenshot of that, you can get the ISBN if you need to record that for purchasing later on. Thanks so much for putting questions in the Q&A box. I really appreciate all the upvotes, and I don't want to take up much more time. I want to get it over to Stephanie so she can ask some of these great questions. Stephanie, take it over.
All right, sounds good. We have some good questions. So our first question, can you talk about nonverbal assessments to identify giftedness?
Yes, not for very long. So I think what we ended up doing was we had profiles, like we made a portfolio for our English learners. And in that's where we were able to have varied assessments. And the district came up with a list of possible assessments that you could use. And then teachers, the AIG teachers were able to select from that bank which ones they wanted to use. So that portfolio had a range of options they could do. Personally, I am not as familiar with the AIG assessments themselves because my world is usually on the English learner side.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and let me throw in that IQ measures are going to be challenging, regardless of as we focus on equity issues. I'm specifically thinking of a study that Jack Naglieri did with Margaret Roning. It published in I'm looking at the article right now, Psychological Assessments. But what they did was they had this big body of 68,000 kids for this study. It was a really big study, and they looked at if we match African American kids with, let's say, white kids who have the same backgrounds. Their parents have similar educational backgrounds, similar income, similar opportunities to learn, presumably. If we match those kids and we give them a nonverbal measure of intelligence, if you look at the mean scores, they're between, let's say, white kids and African American kids on the nonverbal measure, with all of those things being equal, you still get a 0.25 of a standard deviation difference between African American kids and white kids. That's enough to keep a kid out of most gifted programs, right? If that's your upfront loaded instrument. So it's even with nonverbal measures. And now you've got the problem that you've used a nonverbal measure, but you have a highly verbal program, and so you've got that mixed message as well. So there's not an easy answer for that, and I'm. I just wanted to throw that out. Is nonverbal measures are not the sort of the panacea that they, for some districts, have thought that they were.
Right. That's good to keep in mind.
Mm-hmm.
Our second question here, what are the top 3 actions you would recommend to a school district to identify and support these learners if the district has very little training on the topic?
That's a great question. I would say the top 3 would probably be to either research or reach out to a district that's doing it well already. And I provided a list of some of those districts because it's really hard to create a program when it's the blind leading the blind, so to speak. Like, you don't really know what you're doing. So to reach out to some other district or university that knows what they're doing, so you know that what you're doing is research based. And then a second one is to have that buy-in. So buy-in and making sure everyone is on board. And then the last one is creating that culture of advocacy with all invested parties. So from the top, the district, the administrators, the AIG, the English learning teacher, the classroom teachers, the parents, everyone sort of needs to be involved.
And buy your book.
Yes.
Yes, definitely one of the top 3. Yeah, we have another question here. It also mentions, there's a lot of questions that mention instruments and measurements, so we can see what we can do with it. What is the relationship between the identification of ELLs that are gifted and talented using measurements and instruments that have not been normed for English language learners? So
that's a really great question. And the researcher side of me says I don't feel so comfortable answering it because I don't want to say something that research doesn't match.
But I think it's the reason that so many districts have in recent years been moving towards local norms for these kinds of instruments, that if you give a kid, I mean, you've got an English language learner in Pineville, Louisiana, and you're going to compare that kid to a nationally normed population. It's a really rough go for that kid, whereas a local norm would give you a lot more useful data about that child, particularly some of these observation skills that then compare the child to their peer group. So it's those local norms can be very powerful. And with Renzulli and even Marcia Gentry, I mean, and again, depending on your state requirements, you may or may not be able to do this, but just rank ordering of scores, you take the top 10% of scorers on the Hope Scale or something like that is a way of not having to use those national norms, because it can cause a deficit for a kid who doesn't, is in a situation where they haven't had the opportunities to learn that the other kids had that were part of that norming population.
All right. Another question here. Let's see. Have you had a case where a given student does not respond to much in class or do things different than most kids in a given age group, but you later found out that the child was gifted?
Oh, very much so. It usually happened to me in my early years before I had that relationship with the AIG teacher, and I sort of had an idea of what to look for. Once I had an idea of what to look for, it became a little bit easier. but there's certainly children who, fly under the radar, right? Like they're in the classroom and you think, oh, they can't be gifted because they never do their work, or they're off task, or they're just not doing what they need to do. So of course they can't be gifted. And I think that goes back to changing your perception of what gifted looks like. There isn't one model of like, oh, gifted only looks like this. And I think that's especially true for gifted English learners, right? It's not just the most well-behaved child. It's also not the silent child. There's a very broad range, right? Because when you think of English learners, that's anyone else in the world where English isn't their first language, right? And there's so many different cultures out there. And when I say culture, it's not just that shallow culture, but that deep culture of what's expected and how they communicate and what respect looks like and what education looks like. So I think that's really important to consider when thinking about gifted English learners.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, another question here. What can we do to get parents on board? They often don't understand when we tell them their child may be gifted, maybe there's a language barrier, or they're unfamiliar with schools, or they might be afraid to come into the building, or they might not see the program as important.
Great questions, all of which I have experience with. So what I ended up doing was I did year-round activities with my parents, and it wasn't just my gifted English learners, it was all of my English learners. And I had them probably quarterly, like once a quarter, I would do something fun with them. And it was always my best events were ones where the child was showcasing something that they did, right? Because you want the child to be excited in order to get the parent there, right? Because sometimes it's hard to get parents into the building, no matter what background they are. And in some cases, it can be particularly challenging for English learning families. And so the best way that I've been able to do it is to have the child be excited about coming. So we would do readers theater, we would do like games, like we did literacy games with dads, and then we did every year I would always do a Mother's Day gift, because in all cultures moms are important. And so every year my students would make a project for their mom, and then their moms would come in, and then that's where you're able to have that relationship. Because if you have that relationship with the parent, they're much more likely to want to help you or to understand when you say, oh, I see this, your child is doing this, here's some ways you can support it at home, or I'd love if you could come in for this. But if you don't already have that relationship with that parent, it can be very hard. And in some cultures, like in Spanish-speaking cultures, they don't always understand that parents have a role in education, right? In many Spanish-speaking cultures, they view the school as nope, education is you, parenting is me. But really, in our culture, we say, no, they're both, right? Research says that learning happens in both the home and at school. But they don't know that, and you won't teach them that unless you have that relationship.
Yeah, Stephanie, maybe one more question, and then we're hitting the 1 hour mark, so I think maybe one more if we could.
Yeah, sure thing. Can you use exceptional rapid growth on the WIDA axis as an indicator of gifted, talented ability?
Very interesting. I am not familiar with that. To the best of my knowledge, me personally, I did not use that. But it sounds like an interesting resource.
Yeah, one person responded yes, so something to look into.
Something to look at. Very interesting.
And I would mention there was a question about the SIGs and the Hope scale and some of the observation scales that I do think are very powerful for identifying kids who wouldn't traditionally get picked up with other instruments. If you go to the Proofrock homepage and click on webinars and then go to past webinar recordings, there is a whole thing on behavior rating scales that I did with Dr. Leila Sanguras to talk about the different scales and what would be, when you use one versus another. So it's a really a good resource. Having said that, I know know, Mary was nice enough to allow me to share her contact information with you. Let me share that now. If you have some questions that maybe we didn't hit, or and I don't overwhelm her, but if you have some questions, feel free to email Mary. She offered that as an opportunity. So if you want to take a screenshot of her email address, and feel free to contact Mary off list and see if you can get some help with some of the questions that you might have. And also her book is a wonderful resource that that I would commend to you. The book is really well written in that it's not a super academic text. It's a professional learning kind of product, and I think that the language is very practical. I think you've done such a nice job of communicating well to both coordinators and teachers. It was a joy to read the book. It's a fantastic book that you've done. So. Stephanie McCauley, thank you so much for handling the Q&A portion of this recording. I really appreciate your time here. And Mary Campbell, thank you for coming on and talking with us today. It's been a real pleasure.
Yes, thank you for having me.
And thanks for everybody who attended. We sure do appreciate you guys, and we'll visit next time. Thanks. Bye-bye.